It's great to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for putting together an amazing program. I've just yesterday thoroughly enjoyed having my botanical knowledge broadened in every possible interesting direction, and I look forward again to today's talks. I'm going to talk a little about botanical gardens because I now work at one, and it seems appropriate since we're at Kew to perhaps think about the relationship between botanical gardens and the society at large. And so I'm going to dive right in and tell you I have a deep and long-standing interest in the development of early evolutionary thought. And I think far too few people know how much horticulture and botanical knowledge was central to the development of evolutionary ideas in the almost century before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. So let me make a few assertions. Charles Darwin was the most important botanist of the 19th century. He often is not portrayed as such, and I know here at Kew people might argue it's Hooker, but it simply isn't any comparison at all. The problem with Darwin is that he keeps being overshadowed by his botanical works by this book he wrote and published in 1859, On the Origin of Species. You can see the first edition here. So we tend to focus on this, although I think many of us in the room know that he published more than just this book. But he was an avid reader of the botanical and horticultural literature throughout his life. And if you've ever gone to the archives at Cambridge with Darwin's letters and papers and notebooks and so forth, you can do this online, you can just look at the copious notes that he took reading through the botanical literature. Here he is, he took the Annales des Sciences Naturelles Botaniques. He just read 20 years of volumes, paper by paper by paper by paper in the late 1840s, early 1850s. These are his notes on a paper by de Candolle. He was thinking a lot about plants. Here he is reading a book that has just been translated from the German by Schleiden, which has some evolutionary ideas in it. The Plant, the biography, these are Charles Darwin's, one of the pages of his many notes. And basically after he published On the Origin of Species, most of his time was spent thinking about and writing about plants. And this is the set of books that he published after On the Origin of Species in order, starting with Fertilization of Orchids, about pollination biology, all the way through The Movement of Plants, which was not his last book, which was actually on earthworms. So he was an incredibly important botanist, and certainly when you look at the ideas that are contained in different forms of flowers, his work on insectivorous plants, Hooker was a fine taxonomist, a knowledgeable person, but these are where the ideas that gave birth to modern plant evolutionary biology are contained. But I also want to tell you that it's my feeling that he was one of the most, if not the most important horticulturist in the 19th century. And that seems odd. He wasn't a practicing horticulturist. But I want you to know that I have some evidence for this. After he died, in the Gardener's Chronicle and Agricultural Gazette, which was a widely circulated newspaper for professional and strong amateur horticulturists and agriculturists, here's what was written about him. No man has done more to raise horticulture than he who has been laid in his right place in the great abbey. He lives in the hearts of many among us, and being dead, he will yet speak to us through his marvelous works, which have done so much and will yet do more to raise the science and practice of horticulture, as well as botany, to a higher, broader, nobler level than either of them has ever reached heretofore. So that's how he was perceived in the horticultural world upon his death. He was, in fact, an avid consumer and producer of horticultural literature, and he looked to the world of horticulture and plant domestication to gain critical insights into the generation of variation and the process of natural selection that underlies evolutionary change. So he was reading also the horticultural literature, and he was writing in the horticultural literature. Over the course of his life, he wrote 55 notes and articles in Gardener's Chronicle and Agricultural Gazette. That's quite a few, I would say, as well as other horticultural journals. But here you can see one on 1843, double flowers, their origin. Here's another one on variegated leaves in Gardener's Chronicle and Agricultural Gazette. And again, he was doing these things without confessing to anybody that he was thinking about evolution, to gather knowledge, to actually query the horticultural world, and to think about what horticultural knowledge could do to help him understand descent with modification through a selective process. And if you haven't cracked open on The Origin of Species lately, you should, and it bears rereading every so often. But of course, it begins with variation under domestication. He starts his argument by turning to the practical knowledge of horticulture, animal domestication history, and all of the information and insights that could be garnered from them. Then he will start to talk about variation in nature. And if you look inside of this wonderful book, in the first chapter you will see little nuggets of horticulture. In plants, the same gradual process of improvement through the occasional preservation of the best individuals may plainly be recognized in the increasing size and beauty which we now see in the varieties of the heartsease. Those are Johnny jump-ups for Americans. Rose, pelargonium, dahlia, and other plants when compared with the older varieties or with their parent stocks. No one would expect to raise a first-rate melting pear from the seed of the wild pear. And melting pear is a 19th century term for the soft summer pears that you would get here in England. And he is thinking about, again, rates of evolution. He's drawing these from the horticultural literature. And of course, at the end of the book, he's going to sum up, there's no obvious reason why the principles which have acted so efficiently under domestication should not have acted under nature. In the preservation of favored individuals and races during the constantly recurrent struggle for existence, we see the most powerful and ever-acting means of selection. So Darwin was truly one of the great botanists and horticulturists, a plants person. And I think we don't actually take enough credit in our own community for Darwin's connection to plant knowledge and his use of it to make the case for evolution. I tend to think that zoologists kind of own this period of time when they talk about Darwin and when he's portrayed to the public. But Darwin wasn't the only person using plants to gain insight into an evolved world. Some of you will know I have a little bit of an obsession with early evolutionism. It really starts in the 1750s in France. And I have a website with about 70 different individuals, I'll give you the QR code in a second, of people who wrote about evolution before Darwin did. That doesn't mean that they got everything right or even much right, but they had many critical insights. The green names are all people who were plants people. So again, the development of evolutionary thought, the things that Darwin himself could have and was reading were part of the plant world of knowledge. And this is my website. If you want to see a little bit more, each person has a small biography. That's the QR code you have to take a picture of and all that stuff. But I do this in my sort of spare time and enjoy it, and it's a wonderful world to inhabit. And I'm just going to tell you about a few of these people, going back to the early 1800s, and a very important German geologist and plant geographer, Leopold von Buch. He goes in 1815 to the Canary Islands with a botanist from Norway, and he publishes in 1890 this general overview of the flora in the Canary Islands. And he goes on to write in this paper the first theory, which turns out to be quite correct, about allopatric speciation, about dispersal and isolation. Let me give you the translation. The individuals of a genus strike out over the continents, move to far distant places, form varieties which, owing to their segregation, cannot interbreed with other varieties and thus be returned to the original main type. Finally, these varieties become constant and turn into separate species. Later, they may again reach the range of other varieties which have changed in a like manner, and the two will now no longer cross, and thus they behave as two very different species. He could not have been more right. And this is a botanical insight that came from going to the Canary Islands. Here's William Herbert in the UK. In England, he was one of the great hybridizers. He's known for his magnificent book on the Amaryllidaceae, but very early on, as a consequence of trying to hybridize everything, things that people who in the zoological world, there's very few things that are hybridized. We know there's more now. But the botanical world was full of hybrids, and people were doing this for filling botanical gardens. But then you start to look at these hybrids and you realize something quite wonderful. And the very same year that von Buch's paper is published on speciation through dispersal and isolation, same year, a paper is read here in London by William Herbert, and it's about hybridization, showing that members of a genus that can hybridize must be descended genealogically from a common ancestor. If it is meant only that a fertile offspring may be supposed to be intimate that the two parent plants have branched out from one common stock since the creation of the world, I am fully disposed to admit the truth of that position. But I should go much further, considering that many species which we cannot now, by artificial means, prevail upon to intermix, have also descended from one original. So plant hybridization, something that zoologists had no access to because they were mostly looking at this as actually isolation and not the ability to hybridize. In 1890, botanists and horticulturalists knew that this was evidence that things were genealogically related, and that's why they could be crossed. Now let's move to Scotland, and a person who had some of the largest holdings of tree orchards in the world, Patrick Matthew, wrote a book on naval timber and arboriculture. You might think it's a strange book to find evolutionary ideas. It tells you how to grow trees and then saw them up and create the navy that the United Kingdom had then, so it was a rather good business. And here you can see the planks and how they might be sawed. Now, in this book, it comes to Patrick Matthew because he is an arboriculturist that the world is an evolved world, and it's actually the first complete speculation on the process of natural selection. 1832, as nature in all her modifications of life has a power of increase far beyond what is needed to supply the place of what falls by time's decay, those individuals who possess not the requisite strength, swiftness, hardihood, or cunning fall prematurely without reproducing, either a prey to their natural devourer, or sinking under disease generally induced by want of nourishment, their place being occupied by the more perfect of their own kind, who are pressing on the means of subsistence. From the unremitting operation of this law, the breed gradually acquiring the very best possible adaptation to these, to its condition, which it is susceptible of, and when alteration of circumstance occurs, thus changing in character to suit these as far as its nature is susceptible of change. Now, Darwin didn't read this book, but after Origin came out, Patrick Matthew published a very sort of bold statement in Gardener's Chronicle, an agricultural gazette, which Charles Darwin, of course, had to read, which said, I came up with the idea of natural selection way before you did. And Darwin wrote back and said, okay, it's fair enough. Didn't change history, did it? He didn't do anything with this. He didn't write on the origin of species. Here we go to Switzerland, and this is an extremely obscure figure, one I'm working on actually with Peter Enders, who brought him to my attention, almost no scholarship, a whole book on evolution, reflections on species in natural history. And this is by Alexander Maritzi, again a botanist who was actually writing floras of Switzerland. And here he's actually doing what Darwin would be doing. He's looking to domestication history to make an argument that artificial selection is really a subset of natural selection in a process. I hope we do not say that crops are exceptions to the rule. They prove nothing for wild plants. How they would not be subject to the same external influences and governed by the same physical laws. And so he says it's the horticultural art which tells us how a world evolves. So just as Darwin would start on the origin with domestication history, here Maritzi is turning to that very same world to say that if you can take 1,000 years to domesticate something, what would happen if you went on for ages and ages? Matthias Schleiden, you may know Schleiden and Schwann, the cell theory. Well, that's the small part of what Schleiden did. He was a phenomenal botanist. But he used the cell theory to think about descent of all plants from a single-celled organism a long time ago. And he also looked to horticulture. You can see here if the same influences which have been called forth an aberration from the original form of the plant continue to act in the same way, not for centuries or tens of centuries, meaning over horticultural history, but for hundreds of thousands of years, won't we sort of get to the very same thing? And the answer is yes. And here he's going on about the cell theory and the descent. And I notice my slides are being cut off. I can't help you on the bottom, but you get the picture. We move to France. A wonderful horticulturist, Charles Naudin, who comes very close to an idea of natural selection, but doesn't quite. He again turns to horticulture and says, we do not believe that nature has proceeded to form its species in a manner that we ourselves use to create our varieties. Rather, it is nature's process that we have applied to our domestication practices. So again, this is going on in the botanical and horticultural world in the half century leading up to On the Origin of Species. And here you have a monophyletic concept of classification, a perfect and rigorous classification of organic beings of the same kingdom, same order, same family would be nothing other than the genealogical tree of the same species. And you can see it's all about relationship. It's incredible stuff. And that, I believe, is 1852. And we have, just before On the Origin of Species, the few years leading up, Asa Gray, the wonderful professor of botany at Harvard and friend and confidant of Charles Darwin, writing back and forth about biogeography. And it was Gray's interest in the North America, Eastern Asia disjuncts that are, in fact, a huge area of study now, and his statistics of these floras and the similarities. And you can see, by the way, he doesn't say who he's talking to, but while engaged in the preparation of a second edition of the Manual of Botany of the Northern United States, I was requested by an esteemed correspondent. Of course, that was Charles Darwin. We have the letters. You can just go online and read them at the Correspondence Project. And by early 1859, before On the Origin of Species has been published, Asa Gray has taken his statistics of the distribution of plants in Eastern Asia and Eastern North America, and he's put it into an evolved world. I cannot resist the conclusion that the extant vegetable kingdom has a long and eventful history, and that the explanation of apparent anomalies in the geographical distribution of species may be found in the various and prolonged climatic and other physical vicissitudes to which they have been subject in earlier times, and that the interchange of plants between Eastern North America and Eastern Asia is explicable upon the most natural and generally received hypothesis. There you have it, evolution, botany, horticulture, and I think we don't do enough to claim it. So now I'm going to make an argument and a plea that we do more to really encourage people to understand how important a botanical set of facts, plant knowledge, can be to making the society in general understand that we live in an evolved world. So it's not as big a problem in Europe, but I am going to tell you something rather frightening about America, and that is that in general, about 40% of the people who walk around the United States of America don't believe in evolution. That's a really troubling number. It's been very steady for some time. It's basically a disbelief in science. It's a disbelief in reality. There's no easy way to put this. The numbers are much lower in the UK. They're not zero, and they're not zero anywhere, but this is a problem. But even if you do believe in evolution, the question, how do we educate people outside of the academic or botanical professional world, is one that we ought to think about. Where do we actually confront people with evolutionary knowledge, and where do we teach them? And I would argue that we tend to almost always gravitate, families go to natural history museums. This is the Natural History Museum in London, and this is where, in fact, generations of people are introduced as children and throughout their lives to evolutionary knowledge. The problem with this is it's about pattern. It's not about process. These are buildings filled with bones that we've dug up. That doesn't mean there isn't text about process. You can go across to the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and again, you'll see the Hall of Fossils, deep time. It's about pattern. It's telling you something lived a long time ago. But that doesn't necessarily tell you how evolution works. And if you don't believe in evolution, telling you that a bone is old doesn't mean it wasn't miraculously created. To convince people that evolution happens, we have to talk about process. And natural history museums are doubly sort of challenged because look at this wonderful landing page at the Museum of Natural History. And how many of those things are about plants? One, and what you can't see at the bottom is it's the garden lounge, which means it's where you go and get lunch. If that isn't the most atrocious and poorly thought out landing page for a natural history museum to represent plants as a trivial bit of decoration where you drink your coffee or tea, I can't think of anything worse. And I just grabbed that this week. So that's not an old page. So I will say natural history museums have done a very good job of promoting a robust understanding of the evolution of life over the last 3.5 billion years. But actually there's a literature on what people learn when they go to these museums. There are surveys that have done, and this literature tells us that these natural history museum visitors, definitely most of them, first of all, go there, they already believe in evolution, and this reinforces their understanding of that there is an evolutionary world that they live in. But it's really what they're learning there and reinforcing is pattern and history. But what they're not learning is about process, natural selection. And in fact, the surveys show that you can walk into that museum with bones and walk out and you still don't understand natural selection as the process that got us where we are. Now, again, I'll just emphasize the big caveat with natural history museums is if we cede or say, go ahead and take care of this problem, plants will never be part of the story. So I will argue that botanical gardens are natural history museums, and we should always think of them as museums of living objects, never anything else. And what makes a living object so powerful is we can do things with living objects that you can't do with bones. And when you start to think about it this way, you begin to realize that botanical gardens around the world have the opportunity to explain how evolution works. Because of these living objects, we can actually do things and demonstrate very nature of the origin, for example, of novelty and mutation. Museums collect types. They want the most typical thing. What do we collect in botanical gardens? The oddballs, the mutants, the double-flowered varieties. These are not the types, they're the weirdos. What are the weirdos? They are natural variation through mutation. It's evolution, actually in a botanical garden. Here's a page from the website, Paula Rudall, who's probably upstairs, on peloric flowers in foxgloves, and showing that you can actually go out and look, and she does every year, to see whether peloric flowers show up. She's not the first to have thought about peloric flowers and evolution. Here's Charles Darwin in his domestication book. I crossed the peloric snapdragon. He goes on and on and on. And by the way, all the F1s, none of them had peloric flowers. And then what happened when he crossed the F1s? He got about 30% of the F2s were peloric. He did not get the Mendelian genetics out of it, but the numbers are there published showing that he got exactly what you would expect with a trait with a single gene that's recessive. But walk around the Arnold Arboretum. Here's a magnificent European beech. Normally supposed to be a very tall tree, but it has a mutation that makes the branches grow and spiral and go around like corkscrews. And here's Darwin writing, in manner of growth, we have weeping or pendulous varieties of the willow, ash, elm, oak, and yew, and other trees. And this weeping habit is sometimes inherited, though in a singularly capricious manner. Every one of these trees is a mutation that has happened somewhere. And in fact, in these trees, there are 3 populations in Europe of beeches where these are an understory. They're natural mutations. They actually exist in some set of numbers. And I'll tell you about this tree in particular. If we look at the tag at the bottom, you will see that it came to the Arnold Arboretum in 1888 as a graft from Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, which got it from France, where it was originally collected. And we grafted it to keep it true on standard rootstock. So all of these trees can and should be, and we are at the Arnold Arboretum using them to talk about evolution. Now, that tree had a mutation in some of its ancestors that it inherited, but I will also tell you that if you're careful when you walk around a botanical garden, if you work at one, you'll find out that they aren't somehow excluded from evolution themselves. Evolution happens in botanical gardens. Here is a perfectly nice redbud that lives at the Arnold Arboretum, it's Cercis canadensis. And about 15 years ago, 14 or 15 years ago, a point mutation, I'm guessing, in an apical meristem occurred, which changed the colors of the flowers. And how do we know this? We know that redbuds are cauliflorous, meaning that they actually flower on old wood. So I can tell you that there's a branch system starting right up here where the flowers are no longer pink. And I can tell you just by counting the rings in that branch exactly what year, what summer, that mutation happened in that apical meristem. That's evolution. You could never do that in a museum of natural history. And we have used this tree to talk about how mutations are happening all around us. And here you can see that branch, you got the pink flowers on the top. The mutation hasn't actually penetrated all of the apical meristem yet, but it will take over. And this wonderful mutant, which we haven't released yet, actually is something that we will be releasing in the not too distant future. It has magnificent flowers, and it keeps the nectar guides and gets rid of the pink blush. It's extraordinary and incredibly beautiful. But the fact is, we can use botanical gardens to show people something very simple. This is how mutations happen. This is how they can change major characteristics or subtle characteristics, and it's all around you. Now, botanical gardens can also do a lot to just emphasize how much variation there is out there. That's one of the great things. You look at our kalmias and you begin to appreciate that there are a lot of different colors out there. And this is what we do at botanical gardens. We want whole beds of things that vary in all the kinds of things that people have bred and sort of selected for. But in so doing, we have an opportunity to talk about the very essence of what Darwin and Wallace were looking at. How much variation for raw materials is available for selection to act upon. And many gardens have done this. We can talk about artificial selection as a demonstration of descent with modification, whether it's teosinte, or here at the Montreal Botanical Garden, Brassica oleracea, and the incredible domestication history. And if you've ever seen a wild plant, you really have to be pretty impressed at how much can be done with a little bit of sort of selective choices about the characters you're after. But you can show this to people. This is actual evolution. And it's not a simulation on a screen, it's not something that's computerized, and it's not something that's dead. It's actually right there, living proof. Now, hybridization is also a big part of botanical gardens. We love hybridizing things. And of course, we can show hybrids to people and explain that the reason we can hybridize some things and not others has to do with how far they have diverged from each other and how much distance is sort of in the rear view mirror. Here's a wonderful hybrid between the Eastern North America and Eastern Asia Liriodendron that grows at the Arnold Arboretum. And actually, our clump of Liriodendrons has chinensis, it has tulipifera, and right in the middle, it has the hybrid. We can talk about those things. We can teach about those things. And we have hybrids everywhere. The very first hybrid between the Japanese and Chinese species of Hamamelis happened by accident in the 1930s at the Arnold Arboretum. Arnold promised. It's in the horticultural trade the world over. But in fact, we can talk about why this hybrid happened, what the different ages were that when they diverged. And this leads us very naturally into stories of biogeography. Now, this is not microevolution, this is pattern, but I think it's a particularly important pattern. So not only can botanical gardens talk about process, which is something that museums of natural history really can't do with actual objects, but botanical gardens can also talk about pattern. And biogeography is one of the great stories that plant knowledge can offer about the migrations of plants, the changes in temperature, the way things have moved north and south, east and west. And we know all about these incredible dispersals, particularly between Asia and North America, the things that Asa Gray was so interested in. Suzanne Renner works on these things. There are all kinds of things that we can use to talk about these very things. Why should a plant living in Pennsylvania, single species, looks so similar to a plant and a bunch of maples in Eastern Asia? And the answer is they're related. And they're related, and we actually now have dates, last common ancestor, 9 million years ago, but you can see it in their heritage, a close relationship. It's just something we can talk about. Movement, dispersal, migration leads to differences, but not so many that you can't actually tell that you're related. And we have at the Arnold Arboretum one of the most extraordinary collections of disjuncts in the world. And here we go right back to Liriodendron tulipifera and chinensis, and these wonderful things that we can do just to hybridize them. Now, again, with pattern, this is something that many gardens have done. I'll pick on Simon for a minute. When he was at Bristol, he created this beautiful garden which laid out the modern phylogeny of angiosperms. And you could walk through this magnificent garden and learn the latest thinking about phylogenetic relationships. Now, this is not going to convince someone of process, and there's a new one out here. But it certainly gives people part of the package of what it means to live in an evolved world. And I think these are important parts of what we need to do. But I would argue that most botanical gardens do not think that evolution is their job in terms of public teaching and societal knowledge. It really is something we think someone else is supposed to be doing. And I think we do that at our own peril, and it's a mistake for us in the botanical world and the horticultural world not to claim to be central to a story of how we understand evolution and how we teach evolution. So the 2 points I really wish to make and stress are that evolutionary thought was heavily shaped by a knowledge of horticulture and botany, and botanical gardens can and should embrace Darwin and his horticultural and botanical peers. When you come into a botanical garden, you should be confronted with Darwin. And I'm working right now on a new program at the Arnold where you will be learning what Darwin had to say about our plants. And this should be in every garden, I would argue. And the second point is that botanical gardens truly have a unique opportunity to introduce the public to evolutionary thinking in ways that are not threatening. The minute you take people's eyes who are resistant to evolutionary thought away from animals and away from the human condition, you can actually engage in a conversation much more easily than you can when you have to break down a wall that is deeply personal to someone who does not believe in evolution. Plants are much better than animals for that discussion. And if you think I'm the only person who thought that, I'm going to prove that I'm not. So what do I think botanical gardens are? I actually think that they are, when I walk in them, they're a celebration of the very fact of evolution. That's what I'm walking amongst. Collections of mutants, hybrids, patterns of biogeography. All of this is in a botanical garden, but we have to unpack that for the public and do it so that they are literally being educated while they're being delighted by the aesthetics of the flowers that they're seeing. So can botanical gardens do more to promote societal understanding of evolution? The answer unequivocally is yes. Now, after Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, I told you that he turned most of the rest of his life to botanical and horticultural writing, and that the very next book he wrote was on the pollination biology of orchids. And it's on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects and on the good effects of intercrossing. It's published in 1862. For those of you who collect old books, it's the only non-green John Murray. It comes in a purple cover. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's filled with all this wonderful information about the magnificent adaptations that are present in orchids as they co-evolve with their pollinators, and all of these incredible stories. Now, he sends a copy of this book to Asa Gray in 1862 after it's published. He would send various copies from the publisher to his closest friends. And Asa Gray reads the book, and he loves it. And he writes to Charles Darwin in July of 1862 the following: I have just received and glanced at Bentham's address and am amused to see how your beautiful flank movement with the orchid book has nearly overcome his opposition to the origin. And it's interesting just for timing, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with American history, flank movement was what came to mind. This is the Civil War. So you're seeing military terminology showing up in even the correspondence. Well, Darwin gets this letter and he writes back to Asa Gray, of all the carpenters for knocking the right nail on the head, you are the very best. No one else has perceived that my chief interest in my orchid book has been that it was a flank movement on the enemy. So I say, if it was good enough for Charles Darwin, who turned to botany and horticulture, and then after Origin turned to botany and horticulture again, to drive home evolutionary thinking in ways that were far less threatening, we make a mistake in not understanding Darwin's very effective tactics and the very important role that we as members of the botanical community can play in promoting an evolutionary worldview in society at large. So all I want to leave you with is a memory of these books, Darwin's strong understanding that plants were his tool, his key to helping people take that step to being in an evolved world. Thank you.